Welcome everyone to Hume 115 Summary Lectures. I'm Professor Trent, your professor this semester. These summary lectures are not intended to replace your reading. They are not intended to replace your careful work in chapter modules online in Blackboard. They are merely to supplement your reading and to bring all of the concepts together in a summary fashion. If you've got your textbook nearby, please open your PDF. And let's go straight to pages 18 and 19. So with every textbook, I recommend to my students that they actually read the summary first, because the summary in textbook chapters tells you what the student learning outcomes are for that chapter. Usually textbooks also provide you with a glossary of terms for that chapter. So I, in my learning style, find it particularly useful to read the summary first, the glossary words, and that familiarizes me with what I am supposed to learn from the chapter. Then I go back to the beginning and begin reading. I've put in some videos and some resources for you on textbook reading, so you could do it that way, or if there's a method that you've perfected on your own, feel free to use whatever method of reading works for you. The most important thing is that you actually do the reading, okay? That's very important in this course. So start on pages 18 and 19 of chapter 1 in your logical reasoning textbook. So we are on the page that says review major points and the glossary. So in this chapter, you were to learn the basics of logical reasoning or critical thinking. This textbook uses those two terms interchangeably. Logical reasoning can simply mean wise reasoning, correct reasoning. Critical thinking means slow and deep thinking. And what I mean by that is that with critical thinking, which is a skill, it's actually a really important job skill, you are actually taking the time to examine the evidence presented in order to make a wise, logical decision when presented with a problem, okay? So you use critical thinking every day. You probably just don't even realize it when you're making choices about what to buy, where to live, what courses to take, what to do when it comes to your next job, or what do you want to do 5 years from now. You're making all kinds of decisions. The important part in critical thinking is that you are slowing down and digging deep in order to make a decision that is based on evidence, facts, and not merely emotions and feelings in the moment, all right? So let's start back at the beginning of the chapter. Once you've reviewed pages 18 and 19, then we'll go back to the beginning. In this chapter, they present to you how to reason logically. Logical reason or critical thinking is a skill. It's a workforce skill. In fact, it's one of the top sought after skills in the 21st century workforce. Another way to look at it is problem solving. If your supervisor comes to you with a problem, and says, Professor Trent, we have this problem with X. I need you to come up with a solution, by the end of this week, all right? Then as a critical thinker and as an employee, my job is to think through all the different scenarios, possibilities, weighing the pros and cons. Hopefully that sounds familiar from chapter 1, in order to come to a logical, rational decision that is based on evidence. So that is the beginning of this chapter. Now they go a little bit deeper and they look at the whole book. What are we going to be covering in the whole book? I'm at the bottom of page 1. We're going to be covering writing logically, looking for inconsistencies, looking for clarity, spotting any issues amid arguments, avoiding fallacies, and also improving our own arguments and explanations for things. This is probably the most important skill, because once you identify an argument, you understand whether it's clear or unclear. You understand if it has logical fallacies or if it does follow the evidence. Then you can begin to understand how to improve your own critical thinking and arguments. At the end of this term, I'm actually going to have you present an argument. We'll get to that in a few weeks. But all of these skills are going to lead up to you applying this textbook theory to a real life argument that impacts you as a human being living in the 21st century. So if you scoot on over to page 2 and beyond, your textbook has given you a really detailed scenario about this camping trip. All right, so there's an issue presented immediately on this camping trip, and that is the water safe to drink? And the textbook goes through all the different pieces of evidence related to the safety of drinking the water from the stream. This is a really good example of how critical thinking applies in real life. You do a lot of critical thinking, you probably just don't realize it. And so one thing I want you to begin to think about is looking at the different ways and areas in your life in which you're already doing a lot of problem solving and looking for solutions based on evidence. Write that word down, evidence, okay? Think attorneys. Attorneys on both the defendant side and the prosecutor side present evidence for their argument, evidence for their claims. They present facts for their claims. They don't just say, thus and so is guilty because I feel that they are guilty. They present evidence for the fact that the person is guilty or innocent. So think of critical thinking much like a courtroom. Arguments are presented, the evidence is weighed, pros and cons, and an evaluation or a judgment is made based on the evidence, right? That's the best case scenario in critical thinking. We're on page 5 now. Here they give you the definition of an argument. An argument is when you make a claim supported with reason. Write that down. A claim supported with reason. Now, when I say a claim, I mean a stance on something. When I say reason, I mean evidence, facts. In another textbook that I used to use, we called these premises, all right? Premises. So these were like the building blocks of your argument. You have your central claim, and then you built up your argument, your claim, using evidence or premises to support your claim. Now, evidence, reasoning, premises can be strong or weak. They run the gamut, right? Whether they're really good reasons or not so great reasons. And the camping trip talked about some good reasoning and some not so great reasoning. So weighing the pros and cons using principles or a framework of critical thinking. And there's more about those principles on pages 5 and 6. Weighing the pros and cons, we're on page 7. Weighing the pros and cons is really important because essentially what this means is that you are like thinking about, the scales of justice, that imagery in your head. You are literally examining pieces of evidence on either side to determine what the best, logical, most reasonable outcome will be. Just like a scale, some evidence is stronger than others, all right? So think about it this way, visually weighing the pros and cons. They have a nice little list for you in chapter 1 about how weighing the pros and cons works and how you actually play out the evidence in order to make a decision. In other words, you think about, okay, I've got exhibit A, I've got this piece of evidence. If I play it all the way out to the end, to the outcome, what will that look like? An example for you would be when you signed up for courses this semester, hopefully you weighed the pros and cons of the different courses that you would take. You said, if I take Hume 115, then X, Y, and Z will happen. Perhaps it will qualify you to finish your degree, or it's a prerequisite for another class. You literally weighed the pros and cons of your schedule in order to play out what the outcome would be ultimately in the semester. All right, so pages 8 and 9 continue to talk about how weighing the pros and cons works, all right, how all of that plays out. Another example I'm thinking about, I went to page 10, is COVID-19, right? So we're seeing everyone from government administrators to school principals to school districts to healthcare workers to companies to, families, weighing the pros and cons of decisions when it comes to COVID-19, right? Whether to have virtual learning or open in-person schools, for example, whether to create a vaccine or not to create a vaccine, whether to use the vaccine or not use the vaccine, whether to social distance or not social distance. So literally weighing the evidence on all sides. I like to think of it as a circle. I call it a 360, where you're actually examining the evidence, the reasoning from all sides of the circle in order to make the best decision possible. This is what critical thinkers do. But here's the catch. That takes time. That takes some time. And most of us right now are so hurried in our everyday lives. We have so much coming at us, so many different messages, so many pieces of information. We don't slow down enough to say, let me examine all of the evidence. Let me think about that. That's one of the most important things a critical thinker can say. I don't know. Let me think about that. All right. It's okay to say that when someone asks you to make a quick decision about something. It's okay to say, as a critical thinker, let me think about that. Let me examine all the evidence. Let me look at all the outcomes. Let me weigh the pros and cons of the argument. All right. That actually makes you a really smart critical thinker if you're willing to say, I haven't made a decision yet. I'm not so sure. I need to take a step back and take some time to think deeply and slowly about this issue. That's okay. That's actually the mark of a critical thinker. All right, so I'm moving on in the chapters. Please go through and look at logical consistency. That's an important concept. That's on page 14. And then back to 18. All right, as you investigate arguments are claims supported with reasoning. You are going to learn how to recognize arguments, evaluate arguments, and then create your own arguments. Write those three things down. Recognize, evaluate, create your own arguments. Now that you know what an argument is, you know that an argument is made up of evidence, sometimes called premises, but all the evidence has to be weighed as pros and cons and evaluated, and then you ultimately will create your own argument. So your glossary has some great terms. What's really funny is that under the critical thinking term, they asked you to come up with a better definition than what's in there, which is the mark of a critical thinker. So I'd love to hear what your definition of critical thinking is. Mine, I have two actually. Slow, deep thinking, which I've talked to you about. And then my second one is exercising skilled judgment and observation. Critical thinking is exercising skilled judgment and observation, meaning that you slow down, you observe, and you're exercising that muscle, that skilled judgment of evaluating all the evidence. All right, inconsistency, issue, topic, weighing the pros and cons. Please review those glossary terms, and then there's exercises. Although you do not feel that you have to complete the exercises, those are just there as some concept checks for you. Module 1, the soft chalk lesson, is actually really, really helpful in also applying the theory that you learned in chapter 1. So the main takeaway from this chapter is, what is logical reasoning and critical thinking? What is an argument? How do we evaluate and recognize arguments? And weighing the pros and cons of arguments. All right, so hopefully that was helpful. I'm Professor Trent. This was your chapter 1 summary lecture in Hume 115 on logical reasoning. Thanks so much for listening. Take care.